quoting as well himself. He has brought along, I think, a number of copies for us to have and digest. Great holiday reading. Can I just thank and acknowledge John? John's work has actually enabled us to get David here. And I really just want to thank and acknowledge him for working he's actually done, forming that relationship and linking up with David. Obviously, we can't all be here at staff. It's the last week of term and incredibly busy, but an opportunity not to be missed. So we are recording this so we can actually play it back next term for all of our staff. But I do welcome David. Give him a round of applause.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Just putting this here. There you go. I'm conscious that you don't have a lot of time, so the talk that I usually give is about 50 minutes long, so I might skip a couple of slides as we go through, because I think what I'd like to talk to you about is two things, really. One, which is the possible future that our young people will face, and I do that. One of the reasons why I wrote the book is because I don't see that being talked about a lot, certainly not in the UK. And the second is, which runs alongside it, is the exponential rise in what I call social learning. Sometimes people associate social learning with technology, and technology is driving it, but for me, that's not the real attraction for young people. And I'll talk about what I think are the motivations around social learning, and the big challenge for us as educators is, how do we work with these kinds of motivators? How do we bring them into the formal space? But to give you a little bit of context behind the book, a friend of mine's just done a kind of promotional video, so let's just start with that, and I hope it's at the beginning.
Corporations
No, it's not.
and in
Just
the
give me
Arab
a sec.
Spring protest movements.
All right, there we go.
Over the past 10 years, there's been a profound shift in the way we communicate and collaborate with each other. We see it in billion-dollar corporations and in the Arab Spring protest movements, in self-help forums in America and among rural farmers in Africa, in global campaign groups like Occupy, and in local community collectives. We're seeing knowledge shift from being something that used to trickle down from expert to novice, but now it's spread through peer-to-peer networks. Knowledge used to be closely guarded. Now it's common property. Companies used to disclose knowledge on a need-to-know basis. Now the smarter ones don't have any secrets. Instead, they practice radical transparency. And the places where we used to acquire knowledge, schools, colleges, or libraries, are facing an uncertain future because learning is now borderless. We learn on forums, through Twitter, Facebook, and meetups, and it doesn't matter if we're face-to-face or on the opposite sides of the world. And it's not just knowledge we're exchanging. The new sharing economy means we now swap, trade, or pool stuff we use, and the stuff we don't, at a scale that was unimaginable a few years ago. In other words, we're realizing that we don't need the organizations that used to do all this for us. The technical name for this is disintermediation. We're cutting out the middlemen in almost everything we do, and dealing directly with each other. Going open has crept up on us, so we've not yet seen it for the global social movement that it's become. Going open is restoring our belief in each other, and it's helping us retake more control of our lives, improving our neighborhoods, or challenging foreign dictatorships. It's driven by a set of values and attitudes that make us feel better about each other, allowing us to rediscover trust, generosity, and empathy. But it's not all good news. The open movement has really taken off in the places where we socialize. In the places where we work and study, however, more of us are becoming disengaged. We're switching off because the openness and autonomy that we've come to expect socially is missing in all but the most innovative companies and colleges. Going open is irreversible. Now that we have more control over how we live, we're not likely to hand that power back. So it's not a question of whether our schools and workplaces become open, but when, and how we help them do it.
So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to flip through a couple of slides and just get to what I think is the heart of what I mean by going open. And it comes down to a combination of two things, I think. Globalization and that phrase that you heard there, disintermediation. And when I came across this and started writing the book, it was like, you know, when you buy a red car. When you're driving around, all you see are red cars after that. And they were there before, you just never noticed them. And so I saw tons and tons of examples, many of which are in the book, of where companies or organizations have been forced to go open. And I believe that the reason why they're being forced to opened themselves up. And I mean that in terms of the freedom of information, but also the value of the knowledge that they possess. These are just some examples. The open source computer movement has been going open for some time. WikiLeaks, of course, has thrown the whole thing wide open and gives a drama and an urgency to the battle for the internet, which is taking place. Companies like Zappos.com are interesting because there's a company, the largest online retailer of shoes based in America, and their chief executive said, you know what, if you've got a problem working in this company, I want you to put it on our company wiki. I want everybody to see it. When you're dealing with a customer, if you can't sell them a pair of shoes that we've got, tell them where they're going to be able to get them. And he believes that this kind of what's known as radical transparency is the way forward. And I interviewed a guy in the book called Patrick McKenna who runs a venture capital company. And he says, look, we now give the information away. What used to be known as intellectual property no longer exists, partly because you can't keep secrets anyway, but mainly because it isn't the knowledge itself that has value, but it's what we do with that knowledge. And I think this is one of the really radical societal shifts that we've got. So I was a pop musician many, many years ago, and the only way you could reach your audience was to sign up with a record company. Now all you need is a YouTube account, and you've done it. Remember travel agents? We used to get them to book our holidays. Now we just do it all ourselves through TripAdvisor, Expedia, and all those other websites. So I suppose to be accurate, disintermediation hasn't gone away. We've got intermediaries, but they're all digital. And the downside of that, of course, is that we're losing jobs by the handful. Because why would you want to employ somebody when you can computerize and automate the process? So the book is a kind of call to action, and the two kind of, if I had to summarize the book in two little quotes, it's this really, that technology is democratizing learning. But it's not the technology, I believe, that's the attraction for learners, and I use this right across young and old, but we'll concentrate on the young for today since that's our core business. I don't believe it's the technology that in itself is the attraction. But I believe it's the values and attitudes that go along with the technology that make that the technology makes possible, which is a really exciting part of it. But of course, the notion of democratizing learning means that the old idea of there's a bunch of experts sitting in this room called teachers, and there's a bunch of people called students, and they don't know anything and we tell them everything, that's no longer the way the world works. So we have to find a place for ourselves within this new reality. And it's largely to do with this question of knowledge. When Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 1997 in the UK, he said that we were moving into the knowledge economy and that Britain was poised to do really well out of this because we had a ready supply of graduates and English was the language of the knowledge economy. It was the language of the internet. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong because the value of knowledge has plummeted. As I said, people now give this stuff away. And that's partly because countries in Asia have got a ready supply of graduates, endless supply of graduates indeed. If you look in India, we were in India 3-4 weeks ago, and they also speak English. So we don't have the advantage that many predicted we would have. But the other consequence of that is that the axiom in the UK that learning is earning. If you went to university, you were pretty much guaranteed a job. In this new reality, that's no longer going to be the case. The value of a degree isn't going to be worth as much as the portfolio that you present to people. So these two aspects are challenging, I think, or they ought to be challenging, everything about education. And if you want to get a glimpse of the future, go on a website like Elance or Odesk, or in Australia, freelancer.com is a big one, just about to be floated on the stock exchange for huge amounts of money. But what these websites do is they take what used to be a job, a salary job, and they break it down into a series of tasks. So an employer, instead of hiring somebody, will say, okay, we need somebody to do X, and they'll turn it into a project. And they'll go on to Elance and they'll say, who wants to do this work? People from all over the world are bidding to do it. The example I would use if I had more time is a restaurant in Atlanta in America, and they need a business plan written. So what you see is the bids that have come in. And the American companies are bidding to do the business plan, and they're willing to charge $100 an hour. There are Indian companies who will say, we'll do your business plan, and these are graduates, sometimes PhDs. They're saying, we'll do your business plan, and we'll charge $10 an hour. Now, who are you going to hire? So that is what's happening now. We are seeing jobs being broken down into a series of tasks and then shipped out. Now, I gave this talk yesterday to a bunch of young people, and I could see their faces were getting more and more depressed the longer I went on. But I think the good news is, if we think about how we are going to educate our young people and give them the kinds of skills that will make them competitive now in this global marketplace, because it's still true that a lot of Asian people who go on these websites, they have to be told exactly what to do. They haven't really got the capacity to think for themselves. I'm currently hiring a couple of people from India, and it's frustrating because they don't work on their own initiative. My son, who also gets all his work on Elance, he's much more capable of using his own initiative. So we've got an advantage for the moment. Okay, so that's about kind of how we're working. I just want to give you a couple of examples of how social learning is changing the way that we think of skills. Have any of you come across this kid? He's amazing. He's called Jack Andraka, and he's 16 now, but this photograph was taken when he was 15 giving a TED talk, because he'd just come up with a biomarker for pancreatic cancer. His uncle died of pancreatic cancer, and he could see that the tests that were available were prohibitively expensive. So Jack, using no more than what he described as the teenager's two best friends, Google and Wikipedia, has come up with a biomarker for pancreatic cancer which is faster, more reliable, and 1,000 times cheaper than the one that's commercially available. Now, Jack did all his research using Google and Wikipedia, but he needed lab space. So he wrote to 200 universities in America and said, I'm working on this cure for pancreatic cancer, or a marker at least. He said, can I use some of your lab space? And 198 of them said, are you kidding me? You're a 15-year-old kid. How would you know about this? But 2 of them actually said, yeah, you can come in and use the space. And he's now set to be very wealthy as a result of it.
Made deep.
Oh, sorry. But there is another Jack that I want to talk about very briefly and just give you a story, because it could be said that Jack Andraka is a kind of an exception. And he is something of a child prodigy. But to give you a little story, which I share in the book, my eldest son, when he was 15, well, I took him to a thing called WOMAD. They have it in Adelaide, WOMAD. It's the Festival of World Music. And I was interested to see what he'd pick up on. And the thing that he picked up on was what is known as Tuvan throat singing, also called overtone throat singing. If you haven't heard it, I'll give you a very quick snatch.
So that several notes come out the mouth at once. All the noises you hear are inspired by the
No, I'm sorry, I'm flipping about here.
Mongolian landscape, with different sounds for different places. This is the sound of the steppe.
You hear the 2 tones going on at once?
This is the Rocky Mountains.
It's an extraordinary thing. Anyway, he went to see this, thought it was brilliant, best thing he'd ever seen, and 3 weeks later he came around to see me and he said, hey Dad, listen to this. And he produced this amazing overtone. And I said, well, how can this be? I said, you know, conventional wisdom says you've got to go off and you've got to herd yaks and you've got to live off goat's cheese and out in Mongolia. And he said, oh, some English guy did all that about 10 years ago. And then he put it up on the web as a series of learning modules, and I've just taught myself how to do it. So we've gone from 15 years to 3 weeks. And this was the moment that I thought there's something really significant here about social learning. So the last bit really that I wanted to share with you is in looking at what is it that's driving people. And as I say, I don't believe it's the technology. I believe it's because we're reconnecting with some values and attitudes we were probably told were a bit unwise to have. And I'm just going to go through them. I call them the 6 do-its. First one is do it yourself. So there's a kind of autonomy about the learning which happens socially. We all do this. We're all much more capable and we're socially in control now than we used to be. And I can best illustrate this through a story I picked up a few years ago. There's a website in Canada called beyond.ca. And in March 2008 it was, a used car dealer had a kid come along, took the car out for a test drive, gave false ID, and he never came back. So the guy notified the police, but he went up on this forum, and these are souped up performance cars. So you've got a very short time scale to get the car back because they all get stripped down for parts and then sold. So he put a post up here which said, you know, a kid came along, gave false ID, he's about 22 years of age, and the distinguishing thing about him is that he's missing the 2 middle fingers in his left hand. So he kind of gives the rock salute whether he wants to or not. And the car was a Nissan Skyline. He just said, if anybody comes across this kid, it would be great, and there's a reward. So about 4 hours later, one of the people who post on the website was driving around Calgary, pulls up at some lights, and there's the car. And whips out his phone, takes a photograph. So it's only a matter of another 3 or 4 hours now before people say, well, I wonder who this kid is. But another interesting thing happens. I don't know if you ever go on any of these forums. I spend far too much time on them. But they have a thing called the Photoshop meme. So if there's someone who they want to kind of ridicule, they'll just take a photograph and then distort it through Photoshop. Most of these I can't show you because they're far too obscene. But this kid eventually became known for fairly obvious reasons as the Claw. And then once he was known as the Claw, they said, well, we've got to find out where this kid lives. And somebody said, you know, I think he went to Father Lakeham High School. So then somebody else said, well, why don't we go on the Facebook page for that? And they do. And it's only another hour or so before they found out that this kid's called James Jacobson, and he went to Father Lakeham High School. So from then, it's a matter of minutes before somebody says, well, I found out where he works, and this is where he lives as well. So they've got a Google map and everything. So we're only talking about 9 hours after the car's been stolen. Now, the hysteria mounts. By the time this story finishes, 1.5 million people have followed this, and there have been 4,500 posts. So they then go, well, look, let's just go around close to where he lives. And they've never met one another, these people on the forum. So they say, why don't we go to the nearest garage, and then we'll work out what we're going to do. So they say, yep, just shout out beyond. So they go around. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There's about 20 people. They have no idea what they're going to do, and they just kind of go, well, why don't we just drive around to his house and block him in? So that's what they do. The car's in the driveway, they block him in, and then they call the police. And they say to the police, yeah, I believe you've got a stolen car. And the police say, have we? And he said, yeah, well, if you want to come round and arrest the guy, we're round at his house. So the police come round. Of course, they video the whole thing, put it up on YouTube, they get the whole arrest, putting in the handcuffs, everything. 24 hours have gone by between the car being taken out stolen and it's been returned to his owner. Not only that, the car is in immaculate condition. Better than that, the Claw has left his baseball cap on the backseat of the car. So what does the car dealer do? He puts it up on eBay. And he gets $225 for it. So he's actually ahead on the deal. Now, this is where the story could kind of end. Oh, sorry, I should also say, the police, because this has gone viral, the Calgary police were interviewed on TV and they said, oh, you know, we really don't approve of people taking the law into their own hands. But that's the whole point. We do this stuff now because we can. So a funny thing happened after when I came across this story. I was speaking at a conference, and about a week later, the moderator from Beyond.ca sent me an email and said, I think you might want to go back on the forum. So when I went back on, the one that's trending is this. So they'd got a YouTube video of me telling the story about the Claw. And then the whole thing started all over again. They were saying, well, who is this guy? Where's he from? He seems to have an English accent. He's obviously not Canadian. And it starts. And, of course, within minutes, they've identified me because they find a page on Wikipedia. I am apparently Sir David Price, a British Conservative politician. I was born in 1924, and I went to Eton College. Now, I ask you, with this accent. But I didn't know what to do, and I said to my eldest son, I said, what's the protocol for this? And he said, oh, just lurk. Don't actually take part. Just lurk and see what happens. And, of course, within minutes, somebody posts and says, well, he looks pretty good for 86. So it's just a lesson that you don't always get the research right. But it was an incredible example of this sense of autonomy, do it yourself. So what's the second motivator? I've already mentioned this. We're gaining more control of our lives socially. So why are we not more in control of our lives when we're learning? Second big motivator is do it now. there's a kind of immediacy about the learning which takes place socially, which schools really struggle to cope with. There's a guy called John Seeley Brown who has researched surfing communities in Hawaii. And there are now 5 world champions in this tiny part of Hawaii where previously there were none. And they're world champions in this kind of stunt surfing. And the reason why they've got to be so good is every day when they go out, they film one another, but they're also looking at YouTube videos of skateboarders, what they call associated disciplines. And John Seeley Brown says that when these guys come up with a move, 36 hours later, people all around the world are trying this stuff out. So there's a kind of immediacy in social learning which really I think should give us all pause for thought. Third one, do it with friends. You've all come across MOOCs, the massive open online courses. Everybody tends to think of MOOCs as being things that you do as a solitary activity. But here's just one of many, many groups all around the world that are formed. These are a bunch of people who meet every week in a Beijing cafe, and they're following the same course. So they get together as a study group. And we all know that study groups are really powerful. And there's a website called meetup.com which organizes 50,000 meetings around the world. So these are people not in the bedroom on the computer. They're coming together. And just for fun, really, I thought I'll type in some really obscure thing and see if there's a group that meets. So I put in drunken philosophers. And sure enough, up came hundreds of groups of drunken philosophers. They're people who get together in a pub, get drunk, and talk about philosophy. There was even a group in Singapore who meet at the Raffles Hotel. I'd love to be there when they're getting together. So the fourth one, do unto others. There is a sense of generosity and empathy, I think, in social learning, which is hard to replicate. I run a program, I used to run a program in the UK called Musical Futures, and it's become a kind of global, different way of doing high school music. And just recently, we've set up a pilot, but we did it the kind of conventional way. Small number of schools, 15 it was. We'd give them some training, then they'd create some resources, and we're going to scale it up. But we had another 200 schools from around the world who said, we want to be part of this. What are you going to do about it? So we said, okay, well, let's set up a kind of online way of doing this pilot program. So we were going to train these people face to face, and we said, well, we'll video it. That was going to be in a month's time. Before we'd even got started, the lot who were doing it online were already kind of communicating. And these are people in Canada, in the US, in Australia. We set up a weekly Twitter conversation every Wednesday night, and I thought, this will last 2-3 weeks tops. That was 9 months ago. It's still going strong. In fact, there are now people who have got nothing to do with the project, but they just hang out every Wednesday evening, UK time. And what was fascinating was these teachers were saying to one another, well, this is what I do with my kids. What do you do? And they'd put up these videos of them teaching, and they'd show when it was all going wrong. And within minutes, you've got teachers all around the world who are saying, yeah, that happened to me, but if you try doing this, it'll work. So this was all going wrong along around us. We were in the middle of it going, we don't have control of this. Isn't it great? Because these people were just communicating with one another out of a sense of generosity. So the fifth one, do it for fun. There's a sense of playfulness about social learning, which, again, we struggle. I once interviewed Mick Waters, who was in charge of the curriculum at what we call the Qualifications in Curriculum Authority. And Mick said to me, you know, he said, in the UK, he said, we tend to think that learning's got to be like a cold shower. If it isn't hurting, it's not doing you any good. And that's the kind of prevalent view. If we talk about kids having fun, people say, well, they're not really learning, there's no challenge there. But I say to people, if you watch any kid who's stuck on level 4 of Dungeons and Dragons or whatever video game it is and spends the next 12 hours, don't tell me that kid hasn't got resilience and persistence. Kids want the challenge, but they also want the fun. Seymour Papert calls this hard fun when he talks about IT, computing. And I came across this, which is an amazing initiative set up by the University of Washington called Folded. I'm no scientist, so if there's a science teacher in the room, forgive me. But what they've done is they were charged with finding out how amino acids would enable proteins to fold in on one another. There's structures that proteins form in some really persistent diseases like Alzheimer's, heart disease, and cancer. And the best way they could find to actually model this was to get people to play it as a game. So they set up this thing, folded, and each week they set people a problem, which by working collaboratively and in large groups, they can do the computer modeling. And one particular problem, which was about the proteins shapes in monkeys with HIV, it's been around for 15 years, and scientists cannot crack it. And a bunch of people in Texas playing this game solved it in 10 days. So there's a sense in which, yes, it's serious, but they're also having fun doing it. So that sense of playfulness, again, is a real challenge for us as educators. And then the final one, and I think this is perhaps the most significant, which is do it for the world to see. You know, I think kids now are very happy about putting everything out there. Sometimes, you know, to levels that frighten us all. Any of you who've got kids, you'll know that sometimes they don't have the nous in terms of putting stuff out there. But having a public audience for their work is a real great motivator. And there was a woman, a young woman, she's a young girl, 9-year-old girl called Martha Payne in Scotland. And last year, she'd said to her father, this was, actually it was this year, in March, she said to her father, listen, I want to be a journalist. How can I go about it? And he said, well, you need to write. And he said, I would suggest that you set up a blog. So she said, what should I write about? He said, whatever's in your life. So she thought, I know, I'll write about the school dinners that she gets at lunchtime. So she took a photograph every day of her school lunch, and she would rate it, you know, 8 out of 10 for portion size, well, maybe not 8 out of 10 in that one, 7 out of 10 for taste, whatever. Within a few days, it had started to go viral, and the school did the dumbest thing it could possibly do. It said to her, Martha, you've got to take down your blog. It's too embarrassing. So the next day, Jamie Oliver tweeted about it. And of course, 9 million people around the world then bombarded this school and said, don't be silly, improve your school dinners. Let the girl put the blog back up. And she did. And it's massive in the UK. Well, it's big all around the world. To the point where she's combined all the blogs into a book, and she's now published the book, and the income from the book now allows 25 kids in Malawi to have a school lunch every day. So she kind of combines a lot of these motivations. She's got the generosity, she's got the immediacy, and she's doing it for the world to see. I could give you hundreds of examples where kids' schoolwork has gone public, and the level of motivation rises exponentially. So I'm rapidly running out of time. Normally I'd talk a bit more about knowledge, but I think it's probably just worth leaving you with this, because whenever I talk about these 6 imperatives of social learning in the UK, and I say to people, how many of these have you managed to incorporate into your formal learning that the kids are doing? And people usually do this. Oh, is that the time? I've got to go. And I understand that. I know this stuff isn't easy. But the point about it is, and if I can just skip to the end, I was going to talk a bit about disengagement. Oh, sorry, I am going to share this with you. Because I do think if we don't get this, what we're seeing is an epidemic in disengagement. And Ken's here, isn't he? Yeah. I talked about this earlier with Ken. This is the graph of brainwave activity of a bunch of American students. They followed them right throughout the week, 24 hours a day. And what you see is that bit that's homework in red, there's quite a lot of brainwave activity going on. Now, I was surprised at this at first, and then I realized, oh, they'll be multitasking. They'll be SMSing, they're listening to music, and that's why there's a lot of brainwave activity. If you look over here at the yellow bit, the class, it's flatlined. In fact, there's more brainwave activity when they're asleep than when they're in school. And that, I think, is just a graphic illustration of what disengagement looks like, because we've talked about it for ages. And I do want to leave you with this last thought. There's some research which has come out recently, only about 3-4 weeks ago, in Australia, which has followed kids for 20 years and shown that an engaged child from a low socioeconomic background has better life chances than a disengaged child from a well-to-do family. Now, when we talk about social inequality, this is why I get worked up about engagement. It could be a key to making the difference between, you know, giving a kid, and through social learning, we can do this now, we can see that a kid in rural India has got just as many life chances as a kid in middle-class California. So when we get serious about student engagement, we're getting serious about their life prospects. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to stop talking at this point. But thanks for listening.
David does have a taxi to catch at 1:45, but it might be worthwhile if you've got some questions to ask. I would really appreciate that. David, I've really appreciated you actually coming to St Paul's. You were here on Friday because we've applied to become a design hub for learning futures. But I wouldn't mind just hearing a bit of feedback from you, because you made a comment about engagement when you walked around the school on Friday, and you've heard what the DT guys are doing there in terms of engagement with students. Some feedback for us as a staff might be really helpful, and perhaps some thoughts about what we need to look at next. And obviously this is incredibly stimulating, and actually fits beautifully with our vision to be leaders in educational thinking and practice. Really makes you think about why school, and that book that Will Richardson actually wrote, challenging the whole notion of school. But that's a bit of feedback for us now.
Okay,
Questions from the floor?
happily. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. But, well, actually, it's all good. I just think what I've seen and what I saw on Friday was I didn't see a single disengaged child around the school. I walked around for like 40 minutes. So you're obviously getting really high levels of engagement. Personally, I think that you could go that bit further by looking at developing the kinds of skills that they're going to need to work in an interdisciplinary world. If I'd had longer, I would have shared some examples of what I think are really innovative companies. I featured them in the book. People like 3M, who've got 50,000 product lines, being the most innovative company in the world. They've done two things. First one, Google copied. They gave all the staff 15% free time, thinking time. I often think schools could well copy that. Give kids a bit of space and time where they can follow their own passions. But the other thing that they did is they created what I call a kind of machine shop culture, where they brought together scientists with biologists, with physicists, with managers, with accountants. They were all in the same space because they recognized that people are going to be more creative and more inventive if they're working, if you break down those silos. And of course, the biggest form of silo institutions are schools, because we say, you're doing 40 minutes maths, now you're doing 40 minutes English. And I think that what I've seen with the D&T guys is the potential to see that the concept of skills, design skills, collaborative skills, but also problem-solving skills, is something that runs right across all the disciplines. So I'd love to see you guys think about, okay, let's not think about teaching subjects, but let's think about teaching the skills and how could those subjects combine. I know that's not easy because it has timetable implications, it has all sorts of implications. People worry about covering the curriculum, but I'm lucky enough in my work to be able to go to some of the best schools in the world, and I've seen that where they've got bigger blocks of time and they don't worry so much about whether they're covering the curriculum, but whether they're sparking these kids' curiosity. Because when these kids apply to go to university, and I think this is happening now all around the world, top universities are no longer saying, what's your SAT score? They're saying, how good are you at problem solving? And they set them now their own kind of challenges. So I think we do our kids a disservice if we just concentrate on the NAPLAN scores. And I think the ways in which we create the kind of appetite for learning and the equipment of the skilling that we need to solve those problems is to see that the world's an interdisciplinary place, and how can we get these kids to work on projects rather than absorbing information.
Any questions? Comments? Jen?
Could you name a school or two that we could look at just from on my computer, just have a look at what they might
Yep.
be doing? I'm home ec, hospitality. If anyone's got some interesting practices, learning experiences.
Yeah, I'm not sure it'd be necessarily within that area, but there's a school that I always talk about. It's a collection of schools in San Diego called High Tech High, and they are known as a project-based learning school, but it's actually everything about the structure is really about driving student engagement, because they say engagement precedes learning. You can't have deep learning without it. So in terms of the kind of thing that you'd be talking about, they would do things like they would publish a book, say about a book of recipes from all around the world, and the kids would create a meal for the parents. But they'd also have some creative writing within that. They'd have photography because they're taking photographs of the meal. They would have what Ron Berger calls multiple drafts. So they wouldn't just have cooked the meal once, they'll cook it 7 or 8 times, and they'll critique one another. They're really just trying to create a world. Someone once said to me, you know, the best way to prepare kids for the world outside school is to get them in the world outside school. And so they'll treat their kind of environment as a preparation for the world of work. So that's a great school. The school that you're probably familiar with already, Northern Beaches Christian School down in Sydney. I do a lot of work with them. They've done a remarkable transformation of the learning spaces. It's the same kind of school as you've got here, kindergarten right through to year 12. Terrific school, and they've been really brave in terms of their innovations.
David, in my mind, there's a real conversation going on about the whole place and value of school in the future as an organisation and institution. The rise of MOOCs, things like that. Will Richardson's book on why school challenges the notion of school as we know it today. However, in my mind, I'm wrestling back and forward about school is a lot more than just imparting knowledge and skills. It's also about social and emotional development.
Absolutely.
And you can't do that unless you bring people together in relationship with each other to develop those relationships. Any comment, David, about the future of schooling?
Yeah.
And the concept of school as we know it today?
There's a guy called David Thornburg who adopted an Arthur C. Clarke quote when he said, any teacher that can be replaced by a computer should be. And I think he's right. You know, the rise of online learning is a real challenge. Now, having said that, if you look at MOOCs and you look at the last year and a half, because they've only been around for a year and a half, they've got a phenomenally high dropout rate. And the MOOCs that work are the ones that also bring people face to face. You know, we are sociable animals. We want to be with people. And as I said before, we've known for decades that the most effective form of learning is a study group. Now in the UK, we call that cheating. So put kids together and somebody says, oh, you're just going to cheat, aren't you? But we know that it's a really powerful way of learning. So I think what we're probably facing in terms of the school of the future is going to be a place where kids come together maybe 2-3 days a week, but then they're also working on their own, under their own initiative. I don't know if any of you know about the big picture learning schools, but they have kids out working on internships. So for 2 days a week, they'll be placed with an employer, but not making the tea. They're actually doing real high-level work. And then the other 3 days, they come back into the school and they're doing the conventional learning. So I think schools have got to become much more flexible places. The phrase we used in Learning Futures was, we need to think of schools as the base camp for learning, not the final destination. So a school of the future should be a place where kids come together, but then they're off out into the community doing work, doing service-based learning, because that's the world that they're preparing themselves for. So I think the old concept of a place which moves kids around every 50 minutes to do subjects and is enclosed. The analogy I use in the book is we need schools to become global learning commons. So they're porous places, the places where employers come in, and they don't just come in, they are informing the curriculum, and they're invested in these kids' futures. People tend to use the two most powerful groups we've got within school as people that we go to for every now and again we might need something. So employers, you might take the kids out on a day trip. But the other massive underused resource is parents. And I always say to kids in the UK, do you know what your parents do? Do you know what kind of skill set they've got? Because you could be using that. And as a parent, I've often volunteered in my local school to do work for nothing. And they've given me that look, which is, you're not coming in my classroom. You know, and I just think the school of the future needs to be a much more kind of open, porous place, and not this learning enclosure that we currently have. Certainly in the UK, you have these massive fences up around the school. If ever anything says to a kid, you know, this is not like real life, it's sitting in rows of desks in a building that's surrounded that looks a bit like a prison to me.
Any other questions or comments for David? Well, can we just thank David for his time this morning?
Thank you for coming along. Thanks.
As I said, we're in the process of developing a new strategic plan. Mark Vincent's actually here and he's going to be helping the school to do that. And we're looking at scenario planning, building scenarios Centre's actually on the website, and he's been saying some really good stuff on there. And if you'd like to join the conversation, have a look at what John's writing by clicking on the Centre logo on our school website, and perhaps join that conversation, see that thinking space there, so we can wrestle with some of those ideas together. And again, as I said, I do encourage you to read David's book Open. It really is a worthwhile read. Only take you a couple of hours to chew up and have a glass of wine. So thank you again, David. Thank you.